Okay, so recording,
Yep.
recording, we're good.
Lights, camera, action.
And we're both in the picture.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Look at that. Like we knew what we were doing or something. Sometimes. Sometimes we do. All right. Do you want to do the intro this time or?
I will.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg,
I'm Emily.
and we're here to talk about a new book, a first book, first book that this author has published. Scott Alexander Howard, titled The Other Valley. So it was just I believe it was just published this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, earlier this year.
Yep.
And we've been trying to get to this basically all year long, and
Yeah.
things have been getting in the way, and we finally
There's
made it
just so
through
many great things to read. It's hard.
that, and
Mhm.
it's just been a hard year,
Yeah,
another hard year.
it has. Honestly, everybody's busy and doing things. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, The Other Valley. So when I started reading this, straight up, I was like, this author should have been a philosopher. And then I open and I look in the back and he's like, has a doctorate in philosophy from the
Yeah.
University of Toronto and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. So I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Perfect sense.
It
That's
does.
why this is so ethics based.
Yes.
Very interesting in that regard though.
Mhm.
So should I just dive into the
Dive into
synopsis?
it.
All right. The Other Valley. It's advertised as a science fiction, but I would classify this as a fantasy
Yeah.
because there's really no science fiction to it.
Right.
It's about a dimension in which this town in this valley has valleys on other sides that are completely identical. One is 20 years into the future of this one town, and another is 20 years in the past of this
Hmm.
one town. And
The whole world kind of cascades that way, past
yeah,
and future, as
past and
you
future,
go
and
from one
yeah,
valley to the next.
yes. But if you run parallel, apparently it's normal.
Yeah.
Like it's just this valley going
Hmm.
on forever. Um, so the town, it's centered around this girl who they allow visitation between valleys. If something tragic has happened to a loved one or something, and there's a vetting process. But they allow visitations into other valleys as long as everybody is nondescript and anonymous. So they wear masks and nondescript clothing and that kind of thing and allow visitation with guards.
Hmm.
So people could see dead relatives or see children that they never got to see or grandchildren they never got to see, that kind of thing. But of course, it was very carefully vetted. And the story is about this young girl who one day at school notices that there are some masked people visiting the valley. And she can tell by their mannerisms right away who they are. And they're her friend's parents. So she knows that her friend is going to die. And because of this, it kind of throws her into turmoil. Her mother's trying to push her to go be a conciliere or something. He's French Canadian, so like there's a lot of French Canadian stuff in here, like Mademoiselle and Monsieur, prefixes and that sort of thing. There's also no quotation marks for dialogue,
Right.
which a lot of people will find very distracting. As a dyslexic person, I didn't miss them, but some people will be very upset about that. But anyway, so she realizes her friend is going to die. Her mom's trying to push her to be a conciliere, which is a person who is part of the team that does the vetting process for people who want to go visit other valleys.
Hmm.
Um, so as she's kind of going through this turmoil of realizing her friend's going to die on her by some mysterious action, and the normal kid stuff, she's trying to like maintain a normal life in the midst of this because there are laws against telling people. But then she's also been selected based off of an essay she wrote to become a conciliere. And so she is in training for the apprenticeship for that. So the whole first half of this book, part one, is her childhood and the incident.
Hmm.
And then part two, which I'm not going to give spoilers because this is so new, it's
Yeah.
basically the shit show of her life after. Um, because of course, the trauma of losing her friend, knowing what she knows, she was only like a middle schooler at the time. So she's a young teenager,
Hmm.
um, going through all of this with all her hormones and emotions. She ends up falling in love with the boy who's supposed to die, or like starting to fall for him. And it just becomes this huge turmoil. So she basically just, because of the trauma of that, screws up her whole life. Like
Hmm.
she drops out of the apprenticeship, which is a really would be a really great job with really big house in the future. It kind of comes across as this is almost a communist commune setup
Okay.
with the way this is. Like people kind of just have apprenticeships for jobs in the community, and you get a particular type of like hierarchical status in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
So the world itself is very complex, but very, very far-fetched.
Yeah.
Which we already discussed prior to this video a little bit, but yeah, so basically the story is her knowing the things she knows and doing the things she does, and it's the second half is the shit show of her life and everything that happens in the aftermath of her friend's death.
Hmm.
And all kinds of crazy shit does happen.
Okay.
And a lot of it just talks a lot about ethics.
Yeah.
So I will start by saying this is a very dry piece of literature. And I
Yeah.
recognize that right off the bat. I love dry literature. This is like reading the Silmarillion for me. But I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the philosophy and ethics of it and the debate discussions.
Hmm.
And the characters were okay. They were teenagers and kind of obnoxious and stupid.
Yeah.
And the world was very far-fetched. Not all the rules made perfect sense, but it is what it is
Hmm.
for the sake of drama and authorship.
Hmm.
But for the most part, I actually enjoyed this. It was
Okay.
compelling enough that I read through the whole thing. I wouldn't call it a top tale, but it was a fun little adventure and a fun little lesson in ethics.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at with that.
I gotta say I DNF'd, but
Yep.
I DNF'd.
Like,
That's like
like in the last five chapters.
three quarters of the way through,
Yeah.
and I finally said, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah. It's very dry.
Because it's not so much that it's dry, it's just that it has a kind of interesting world,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't buy it
Yeah. It's very
because it's
far-fetched.
a lot of the rules, a lot of the structure just don't make sense to me. It's like,
Mhm.
well, if the world is structured this way, because I mean, look at our world. If I call somebody in California, I'm two hours ahead of them.
Yeah. You're in the future.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what's happening here, except it's much more dramatic.
Yeah.
They're
Different
going
time
across these time
zones.
zones. Well, I would expect it to be structured where they accommodate that and can exist in, they're all confined to these little valleys
Mm-hmm.
and they can't leave them.
Mm-hmm.
They can look across the river to the other valley
Mm-hmm. To the
and
mountains by the other.
to the
Yeah.
mountain. Yeah, they can look across to the other time zone.
Mm-hmm.
They're that close.
Yeah.
Why not interact?
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be a much more interesting society if you
Yeah.
had these interactions across 20 years of time and they get used to that idea and build it into their society and their philosophy and their ethics and
And it sounds like that's kind of what they're trying to do, because one of the
okay.
things is if you alter a situation in one of the valleys in the past, it erases you and creates a new valley in the future.
Okay.
So the erasure is most of the reason why
Hmm.
they don't do that. But also it's a system of ethics too, where if that person doesn't cross back into their previous valley, they can still exist
Yeah.
in this one. And in order to keep people from finding out what the new stuff is going to be, or like basically abusing the power of seeing into the past or the future,
Okay.
they can't, they're trying to like create these limitations so that it's a vetting process. You can still go visit those things, but people can't know because you don't want there to be some kind of incident that causes an intervention or and then creates a whole new valley in the next 20 years.
Okay.
So it kind of like erases and resets
Hmm.
the entire timeline of the next valley over.
Hmm. But it's kind of like my problem I had with Asimov's Nightfall,
Mm-hmm.
where the story is too much from our mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in a situation where these people have grown up and evolved under this situation,
Hmm.
but they're using our mindset to approach it.
Hmm.
And that's just not realistic. They would have a completely different mindset from us based on how their world is so different.
Hmm.
They would think differently about time. They would interact with each other
Hmm.
differently as a result of this time differentiation.
Hmm.
They would have a culture that we couldn't have on this planet
Hmm.
because it would be based on this fact that their neighbors are 20 years into the future.
Yeah, I kind of want to see what does it go on into infinity?
Yeah, really.
Like I that's what I want to know.
Can you
Like
just
could you
keep
go
going
to the next
across the
valley over
horizon?
and the next valley over and the next valley over and the next valley over
And what is
forever?
that
Yeah.
planet shaped like? Is it a sphere?
Yeah. Is it a
Do
plane?
you come back around to the
No, I
past?
want
It's like,
to know more.
yeah, there's just a lot of things that I feel are not
Hmm.
thought out in this book.
Yeah, and it is his first novel, so
Yeah.
I get that. And there's interesting ethics and philosophical points that are
Okay.
made in it, but for the most part, yeah, I don't know that it was a perfect execution. It was still enjoyable though. You just have to lean really hard on plausible deniability,
Yeah.
and that's hard
But
for people.
you have this world, and the three-quarters of the book that I read is just all about this person going through school and then all of a sudden get to part two and they're an adult and in a completely different job than what they went to school for. Well, okay, that
That happens in
happens.
real life.
Yeah. But I
Trauma
mean,
happens in the midst
why?
of that.
It's not really explained, at least not
Mhm.
right away, maybe in
Yeah,
later
and
on.
later on in the
But
part two, it does
it's
explain it a
it's
little.
still just a character story and it's not digging into this weird time thing very much.
Hmm. Why
And
is it like this? Hmm.
well, I don't think he has to go into how this world came to be, but
Hmm.
just more of how this situation is, just more going on, just more
Hmm.
story.
Yeah. And it seems like there needs to be a lot more moving parts than what was presented in this book. I would love
Mhm.
to see more from this universe
Okay.
because it's intriguing to me. But this, a lot more than half of this book was set up for the actual action,
Hmm.
which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there could have been more going on.
Yeah, I mean, how a lot of authors would handle that is they'd have chapter one where they have something from the future happen, something happening right
Hmm.
off the bat, and then they go back in time
Hmm.
and give you all that background
Yeah.
so that you're going to get to this
Yeah.
point where there's this
But that
cool
doesn't
thing
happen
happening.
until about
Yeah, this book doesn't.
here in the oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Literally this chapter is
Oh
where
no.
it starts.
And that's like
Where all the
7/8
action
of the book
starts. Yeah.
that
Starts
you
in there.
finally get to something,
Yeah, where it
some
starts
meat.
becoming more detrimental and well, the thing is we're dealing with a character who has a lot of critical thinking, but is trying to piece together a lot of unknowns. Which isn't necessarily a flaw of the book in my opinion, but I could see how a lot of people have a hard time with the rationale because we are seeing it from the perspective of a teenage girl who eventually becomes an adult who's traumatized and fucked up her own life
Hmm.
because of this trauma she experienced from her friend's death,
Okay.
which she feels responsible for personally. And
Hmm.
then all the aftermath from other people who are trying to visit the valley to go see her dead friend that she knows personally. Like there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of death.
And another weakness of this book,
Hmm.
it was written by a man. I'm a man reading it. Most of the time, the main character is a woman, but most of the time it didn't feel like it.
No. She felt like she was
Every now and then I'd come
probably
across
a
something
unisex,
that would
like
remind me.
non-binary
Every
person.
now and then I'd come across something that reminded me she was a woman, and I'd go, "Oh, I'm thinking it's a guy,"
Yeah. Keep
Um,
forgetting it's a dude. Yeah.
yeah, it
Hmm.
really seemed that way.
Yeah.
It did not seem like he was writing about a woman.
That I would definitely agree with, especially a
Which,
teenage girl, which there would be a lot more hormonal
that
things going
it's
on.
I'm not the first person to make that
Hmm.
observation that
She's a
guys have
remarkably
a hard time writing women.
stoic. Yeah, and she's a remarkably stoic character, which is very unrealistic, I think, for a teenage girl. I mean,
Okay.
I was 10 once and I was all over the place emotionally. He tried. Like the whole kind of her falling for the character who passes
Okay.
is kind of
This
kind of
stuff's.
a step into that. Like he's
Hmm.
trying to make it seem like normal teenage girl stuff.
Hmm.
But yeah, she's extremely socially awkward, is how I wrote that off.
Okay.
Um, to the best of my ability.
Yeah.
And again, that's leaning on plausible deniability. It's that she's just really socially awkward and really emotionally stunted.
Hmm.
But she also had a previous tragedy, which her father committed suicide.
Hmm.
So being emotionally stunted from that experience and her mom being a severe alcoholic, I
Yeah.
could see her being an emotionally stunted person, very socially awkward,
Hmm.
and not being able to be that relatable as a teenage girl.
Yeah.
At least not compared to the other two. I felt like Justine and Joe, I think they were called, two of her friends who were females, came across as a lot more realistic than she did.
Yeah.
And we're getting her POV.
Hmm.
So, but yeah,
And like you said, it's marketed as science fiction. This is not
it's
science
not.
fiction.
It's
I'm more
fantasy.
of a science fiction person, and what I'm the kind of rigorous um building of futures and worlds that I'm the more scientific logical building of
Hmm.
those things that I'm used to from Asimov and Heinlein and Clark is not here.
Yeah.
And it's more like Mordor, where there's things that are just aren't explainable
Yeah.
in our world.
Things that were things that are and things
You
that
know,
have not
you
yet
you
come
got to
to
look at it
pass.
that way. You got to look
Yeah.
at it as a fantasy novel, and in that way, it's if you approach it that way, I think it's a lot more
Hmm.
enjoyable.
Yes, I would agree with that. And that's kind of what I went into right away is like the more I started reading it, I'm like, this is science fiction. This is
Hmm.
fantasy. This is like it's kind of in a nondescript time period too. They aren't talking about computers or anything like that. So I'm
Yeah,
like basing it on maybe 1950s style things. Like there's a lot
have
to
cars.
yeah, they have cars, so I mean that existed.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, and buses.
Hmm.
But yeah, a lot of the technology that we're used to isn't there. So trying to figure out some of those things, there are a lot of unknowns, and you do have to kind of make up a lot of your own assumptions.
Yeah.
And again, as a dyslexic person, I did not mind the missing quotation marks, but that's really going to bother a lot of people.
What I found about that, I've got two things to say about it. First
Yeah.
of all, reading the book, it was easy enough to read without them.
Yeah.
But lacking those quotation marks gives it a different tone.
Hmm.
Okay.
It almost seems like it's all point of view and not actually
Yeah,
dialogue.
right.
Hmm.
So it feels different. And I kind of took it as he's just trying to be cool like Cormac McCarthy
Hmm.
and skip
Yeah.
punctuation.
I've never,
There was no good reason not to put quotation marks in this book.
yeah. And I've read things without quotation marks before and didn't
Okay.
miss them. There was a book I called I Don't Know How She Does It. It's about a mom who's in the business world and juggling all her crazy life.
Hmm.
But there were no quotation marks in that. If it was actual dialogue, it was italicized.
Mm.
So at least
At
it was
least it
like
was italicized.
distinguished, yeah.
I mean, there
And
is
I
a reason why we do things
think
like that.
Bridget Jones's a version of Bridget Jones's Diary I read was like that too. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, Flowers for Algernon did that,
Insert, yeah.
but it was because it was a mentally deficient person
Yeah.
writing
Someone with
most of the
special
book.
needs, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, should we consider Scott Alexander Howard and Cormac McCarthy to be mentally deficient, like Charlie Gordon?
I wouldn't go that far. This is too there's a lot of very deep, thought-provoking ethics in this to make me think that they are not.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, it is a pretty dry piece of literature and it is for young adults. So you have to have a particular kind of young adult, I think, to appreciate this book. Someone like me who likes dry literature or likes philosophy would probably enjoy this because of the thought that goes into it, but there's not a lot of action. It is just a lot of experience and
Yeah.
you experiencing from the point of view of our main character in a particular timeline.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's all I can really say about it without getting into spoilers. Because I think some people will actually enjoy this, but it's a hit
Okay.
or miss. It's a
Okay.
hit or miss. This is
Missed with
this is
me.
yeah, this is it hit with me, but it's not top tail material, in
No.
my opinion. I think it has too many hangups. But I think it's pretty fun for a first novel. It's a very
Okay.
interesting concept. So I would love to see more in this world and see a little bit more of it fleshed out, or to see
Hmm.
how the community evolves from one set of rules to adapting as things change or incidences come up. I think would be really interesting.
Hmm.
Or to see how, with certain technological developments, they would behave. I think that would be interesting too. But yeah,
Well, or there's there's a lot of cool possibilities. If you
yeah,
got a valley 20 years in the future, they could share some of their discoveries back to the past
yeah.
and really accelerate
Yes.
technological
There's
growth in
also
this place, but that's not explored.
there's a legend in here as well about a certain point on the border between two valleys in the mountains where you can't die.
Hmm.
Like if you're not killed, you live forever.
Hmm.
So that would be fun to explore in this world as well. Or seeing like what happens if entire revolts start happening between valleys or wars are started. Seeing how that happens would be
Hmm.
interesting. So, I mean, there's a lot you could play with in this
Yeah,
and a lot of turmoil you could cause.
yeah.
But overall, I will also warn this is kind of a tragic book. There's a lot of
Okay,
heaviness in here. So, like, just be aware of that if you decide to pick it up.
okay.
You're aware of it, but still when it happens, it's real sad.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's all I got to say about it.
Okay, so recommended for for younger fantasy readers that um, are okay with something that isn't action heavy.
Yes. Yes, very thought-provoking, but not
Yeah.
action heavy.
Hmm.
But yeah,
Anything else?
no, I can't think of anything else. I love the cover though.
I do too.
The
That's the best thing about it is the I love the illustration's kind of simple, but the way it does those steps
Mhm.
and they emboss
To
it,
the duplicate valleys. Yeah.
it's really well done graphic design, which of
Hmm.
course as a graphic designer I love.
Yes. So this is a book.
So buy it for the cover,
Yeah, it's a pretty book. It's pretty
frame
nice
it, put it
cover.
on your wall, throw the book away.
There is a person who
Burn
likes
the
this. I
book.
liked it. Yeah, I liked it, but it's not. It felt like a young adult book to me. There's not a lot of young adult books that I can read, and I'm not like they tend to be very complex and very interesting. Just because you are trying to grab an audience who is younger
Hmm.
and is has a shorter attention span.
Hmm.
Um, but I hyper focused and got through this book just fine. So if you have hyper focusers, they could probably enjoy this too. And it was a very fast read. Like I had it done in
Yeah,
like
yeah, I mean, I did read
three
quite a
several
ways
hour sit
through it.
downs,
It
and I was
was not a
good.
trouble to read it, and
Yeah.
it wasn't a difficult read. The
Hmm.
lack of quotation marks didn't really slow me
Yeah, it
down.
didn't slow me down either.
Um, good things to say there. It just, I got to where I got, and I thought,
Why am I
why
trying?
am I
Yeah.
wasting my time on this?
Yeah,
Nothing's
literally all the
happening.
action starts where you pretty much like two chapters after where you ended.
Oh boy.
So, I mean, it isn't for everybody.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm done.
Okay. So, have you read The Other Valley? If so, we want your comments. See what you have to think about, especially if there's somebody out there that thinks this is a great book. Argue with us, tell us why you
We want
think it's a
your
great book.
rationale. We
Yeah,
love your rationale. Your commentary too. We'll take it off. Snide remarks even. Just as
yeah.
long as you're not too mean. Be kind to each other.
Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah.
So leave your comments. We want to hear them
Hmm.
in the comment section for everybody to appreciate.
Hmm.
And I don't know if this guy writes more, we'll probably
I'll give it
give
over
it
at
a
least.
chance at
Yeah,
least.
I
So
would
we
love to
may
see.
have more Scott Alexander Howard in the future
Hmm.
if he writes more.
Yes.
There are some people that write one book and disappear.
Yeah,
You never know.
you never know. So we'll
Um,
see what comes down the line.
but we have lots and lots of other stuff we're talking about until then. So like the video, subscribe to our channel, and come on back and see us some more.
So thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.